The Marine Corps would always tell you like 10% of the people cause 90% of your problems. And it seems to hold true no matter where I've been.
Welcome to Panama City. It's late afternoon here, and the heat hangs heavy over the financial district like a wet rag. Palm trees are bending in the breeze, while the low horns of cargo ships drift inland from the canal just a few blocks away. Today, we're standing in front of one very specific office building. The sign on the wall reads Mossack Fonseca. To the outside world, it looks just like any other international law firm, but here, Secrecy is the most sought-after legal advice. For decades, Mossack Fonseca has crafted companies without countries, assets without names, and fortunes without fingerprints. In this world, power is not measured in nations or armies, but in the ability to disappear one's own riches without so much as a whisper. According to reports, Mossack Fonseca has helped presidents, billionaires, celebrities, oligarchs, and fugitives move their fortunes through shell corporations and offshore entities created inside these offices. Public figures like Vladimir Putin, Nawaz Sharif, Lionel Messi, and even Jackie Chan have reportedly used their legal services. Some use offshore structures legally to reduce enormous tax burdens or protect wealth from unstable governments. But others, however, well, they use them to conceal fortunes tied to fraud or bribery, corruption, sanctions evasions, and organized crime. Here, money is moved for a price across jurisdictions placed beyond the reach of the public, tax authorities, and sometimes law enforcement itself. For Mossack Fonseca, it's just another day at the office, but what nobody here realizes yet is that somewhere outside this building, the system protecting those secrets is already beginning to crack. And soon, 11.5 million confidential documents will begin slipping into the hands of journalists around the world. Secrets once locked away inside offshore vaults and private legal files will suddenly appear on the front page of newspapers, flash across television news broadcasts, and spread through social feeds viewed by millions. The secrets of the rich and powerful will be dragged into the public square, where prime ministers will be toppled and titans hiding fortunes will fall. But how and who will expose them? We'll investigate it all on this episode of the CISO Signal. And joining us is our guest co-host, Michael Darling, CEO of Solstice Security, former Marine Corps cyber leader and guardian of some of America's most sensitive systems. Michael, welcome to the CISO Signal. It's great to have you with us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Excellent. Let's begin the investigation. We are in the midst of a ceaseless war, not of bombs or bullets, but of breaches, firewalls, and silent incursions. The targets? Our borders, our banks, our commerce, and the critical infrastructure that underpins a free civilization. The enemy is cloaked in code, fueled by greed, glory, and a desire for chaos. This is the story of the unseen protectors, the nameless generals, the CISOs, Chief Information Security Officers. They are the guardians at the gate, the watchers on the wall, ever vigilant and always listening for the CISO Signal. Act 1. The Hidden Machine. Do you remember when you first heard about the Panama Papers? Where were you? What went through your mind? Did you have any ideas and a sort of a grasp of the scale and scope of what was about to hit the lights?
It was right after I'd left the government, and I just remember thinking, must be an intelligence operation. This is the era of WikiLeaks. This is the era of the FSB hacking certain political parties, that sort of thing. And I just remember thinking that this is a really big deal and probably gonna make a lot of very important people very nervous.
Mossack Fonseca was quietly helping manage more than 200,000 offshore entities across multiple jurisdictions, shell companies layered upon shell companies, directors who existed only on paper, and addresses that led to empty rooms. Entire fortunes floating through invisible corridors of ownership. Not money hidden in safes, money hidden in legal structures. The hacker here didn't want money. What they were looking for, they believed, was justice. How does that change how a CISO prepares for an attacker whose motive isn't profit, but their own ideology?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the first thing you have to remember is that integrity matters, and personal integrity and the integrity of the organization that you're working for. This is already a really hard job. There's lots and lots of people trying to get in, trying to compromise your networks. And it's twice as hard if you're working for people who maybe aren't honest, who maybe aren't following the laws. And that creates a real tension of how you should respond. Secondly, you have to understand where you fit into like a political spectrum. If you're dealing with a lot of these people, that comes with consequences. Maybe some of your employees don't love everybody you're working for. And it creates a serious ethical problem for people internally if you're not following the law.
Like a parallel financial architecture where ownership can dissolve behind legal abstractions the way a submarine slowly dips beneath black water. A mining executive in Africa, a billionaire in Moscow, a politician in Europe, even a celebrity avoiding publicity, or a fraudster laundering stolen funds. Inside the offshore system, they can all hide behind a legal cloak of anonymity. All you need is a simple signature, a passport scan, a nominee director, and a financial transfer. And then suddenly, a new corporation is born. According to reporting later published by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists and Süddeutsche Zeitung, Mossack Fonseca built offshore entities in jurisdictions including the British Virgin Islands, Panama, the Seychelles, Hong Kong, Nevada, and Wyoming. The paperwork moved endlessly. Emails, certificates, registrations, power of attorney documents. Every day employees processed another stream of invisible ownership, not with malice, but with routine. That was the unsettling part. History often imagines corruption as dramatic, larger-than-life men flanked by angry henchmen while they chew on expensive cigars in smoke-filled rooms, suitcases full of cash being slid slowly across a table with steely-eyed threats whispered over expensive whiskey.
It's a new challenge, I think, especially in the modern West, where so many younger employees feel as if their political views can somehow govern whether they will help a customer or not help a customer. And that puts corporations in a very difficult position from a business point of view as well as a legal one.
Yeah, and absolutely. It's one of the difficulties that we have today. We have so much information flowing around us. It's what actually made this breach possible. It's like if all this information were in filing cabinets, like it would be a much more difficult problem to deal with. I think it just comes back to integrity matters and doing the right thing matters.
But large systems rarely survive through drama. They survive through administration, through exhausted assistants attaching PDFs at 7:42 p.m. at the end of a long work week, through compliance officers clicking approved, through accountants who stop asking questions because the paperwork technically checks out. Inside Mossack Fonseca, the atmosphere reportedly resembled a normal international law office more than a criminal conspiracy headquarters. Reception desks, corporate stationery, air conditioning humming softly against tropical heat. And perhaps that was what made it dangerous, because systems become hardest to see when they start feeling ordinary.
Law firms were seen after this as a soft underbelly of sorts of global finance. Why do you think law and professional service firms struggle so much with security?
Number one, we deal in sensitive information all day, every day. It may be perfectly legitimate that a lawyer is sending hundreds of Social Security numbers to a client because they're dealing with the litigation. And I think that's the biggest challenge. You have this distributed set of responsibilities because every partner kind of has their own book of business.
By 2015, offshore finance had become woven into the bloodstream of globalization itself. Wealth moved faster than governments, faster than regulators, faster than public understanding. A shell company can be created in hours, whereas an investigation, it can take years.
You come obviously from a law background, and you've secured one of the largest law firms in the world. What's the most misunderstood challenge in securing professional service environments, you think?
In both professional services and lawyers, but especially lawyers, every moment that you're spent not servicing your client, you're not making money. The billable hours really matter. So when you design your security program, when you design how people interact with that security program, you need to do it in the most efficient manner possible.
And then one day, someone inside the shadows decided to open the vault. The first message arrived quietly, just a contact initiated with a journalist at Süddeutsche Zeitung, the German newspaper. All the message said was, interested in data?
The breach shook power structures. How do you think CISOs should think about political fallout, national security ripple effects in these kind of situations?
Well, I think it's important to understand where you sit in that political realm. And, in an age of globalization, when everybody's kind of coming together, working together, geopolitics doesn't really matter as much. So you've got an entire generation of people who kind of grew up with politics not mattering. But in an age of great power competition that we're moving into, it does matter.
The reporter on the receiving end was Bastian Obermeyer, according to public reporting. The source identified themselves only later as John Doe. The name sounded fake because it was meant to. According to later statements attributed to the source, they wanted neither money nor recognition, only anonymity and the safety of encryption.
And who you work with matters. If you are working with clients who maybe a certain aggressive national government doesn't like, that doesn't mean you shouldn't, but you should be aware that now you're a potential target. But I think it's also important to remember that law firms, depending on what they do, especially if they do things like IP or litigation, things that move markets or are really sensitive information, they're going to be a target for those organizations anyway.
The source reportedly told journalists their life was in danger. At first, nobody understood the scale of what was being offered. The transfers began slowly, encrypted communication, small batches of files, then larger ones, then terabytes. Millions of documents, passports, bank records, contracts, and internal emails stretching back decades.
How do you build a program where people don't just follow rules, but believe in safeguarding trust?
First and foremost, you have to understand what your job is, what security is. Security is never an end of itself. It's an enabling somebody else. We make other people better at their jobs. And so if you tell somebody that they're the first line of defense, they're the last line of the defense, you're part of this team. We depend on you just like you depend on us. I think that's where you start with the culture. And then you just keep working on it, and you got to live that principle.
The amount of material was so vast that journalists reportedly struggled simply to store it, let alone read it. The leak ultimately totaled approximately 11.5 million files and roughly 2.6 terabytes of information. It was less like receiving documents and more like being handed the entire contents of a civilization's hidden secrets. And somewhere inside Mossack Fonseca, normal life continued. Phones rang, assistants scheduled meetings, coffee machines hissed down the hall, and employees reviewed incorporation forms beneath the flicker of a fluorescent light, unaware that the architecture around them had already begun collapsing.
What signs tell you an organization is treating security just like a checkbox, versus, say, a true pillar of ethics and trust.
One of the things that you look at is, are people coming to you or are you going to them? And then really, really important from a leadership standpoint, do you talk to leadership every, once a quarter, or are you getting calls of how much are people actually thinking about this when you're not around?
Because the terrifying thing about catastrophic breaches is that they often occur silently. Not with masked men storming the lobby, just with data seeping away, one file at a time. According to some later cybersecurity analysis, the firm may have suffered from weak security practices, including outdated web infrastructure and vulnerable internet-facing systems, but the exact breach mechanism has never been publicly confirmed with certainty. Some investigators suspected an external compromise. Others believed insider access was more likely. Even now, the true origin remains partially obscured, which somehow makes it worse, because uncertainty creates a virulent form of paranoia, and paranoia spreads faster than any virus or malware. By early 2016, journalists across multiple countries had secretly joined what would become one of the world's largest collaborative investigations in modern history. Reporters worked behind encrypted systems and compartmentalized communications, aware that exposure before publication could trigger lawsuits, political pressure, or worse. And they began reading the files. A realization emerged slowly, and then all at once. This was not simply evidence of hidden wealth, it was a map of hidden power, and hidden power behaves unpredictably when dragged into sunlight. Far above the streets of Panama City, thunder rolled across the skyline, and inside Mossack Fonseca, office lights still glowed long after dark. The employees could not yet see the danger approaching. Act 2. The exposure. At first, the journalists stopped sleeping. Then, they stopped trusting their phones. And then they stopped saying certain names out loud. The operation had spread quietly across continents by then. According to public reports, journalists from more than 80 countries had joined the investigation under the coordination of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, or ICIJ. Hundreds of journalists, dozens of publications, all using secure chat systems, encrypted file exchanges, air-gapped machines. Not because they were handling state secrets, because they were handling something far more dangerous: evidence. Inside newsrooms from Munich to Washington, reporters began tracing ownership chains that twisted through shell corporations like electrical wiring hidden behind a wall.
Where is the line between legitimate whistleblowing and unlawful exposure, and who gets to draw that, do you think?
Technically, whatever the law says, whatever jurisdiction you are in, is what is unlawful exposure. The world is messy. There's a lot of shades of gray in between the black and white of right and wrong. Confidentiality matters. As a human being, we need to be able to have secrets. That ethical line of, hey, this is legitimate confidentiality, and this is illegality. This is doing the wrong thing.
One company owned another, which owned another, which owned a trust, which controlled an account, which financed a mansion, which purchased a yacht, which quietly benefited someone whose name never appeared anywhere near the money. That was the genius of the offshore system. No hiding transactions, hiding proximity. And now the entire machine was leaking onto journalists' screens by the terabyte. According to reporting later published by the ICIJ and partner organizations, the files stretch from the 1970s through to 2015. Emails and corporation records, scanned passports, internal compliance notes, bank instructions, and lots of photographs.
For the folks who don't understand the whole concept of these offshore accounts, where essentially public figures, celebrities, tycoons, business moguls with billions or hundreds of millions of dollars might say, or so they're advised by their financial advisors to put that money in these places largely because of tax shelter. What's the motivation and how does it work in a way that it's legal?
Where we see in this case with the Panama Papers is that can also be abuse. That can be front companies for terrorist organizations, money laundering for drug lords. It can be illegal tax evasion. And again, that's where these kind of like fuzzy lines of what's right and what's legal and what's not, that's where that comes into play. Because when you start talking about cross-jurisdictional laws, it gets real complex real fast.
Millions of fragments, each meaningless alone, but devastating together. Some reporters describe the experience less like reading documents and more like excavating a buried civilization. And buried civilizations contain kings. The first names began surfacing slowly, and then, all at once, relatives of presidents, associates of dictators, former intelligence figures, mining tycoons, energy magnates, arms brokers. According to multiple investigations, offshore structures linked to associates of Vladimir Putin appeared in the files through complex financial arrangements reportedly moving billions of dollars. Elsewhere, journalists connected offshore entities to relatives of political leaders across Asia, the Middle East, Europe, Africa, and Latin America.
If you were there in the weeks and months before and you were in a position where you could advise Mossack Fonseca before this breach, what's the first control or perhaps cultural shift you'd have pushed for internally with them?
Don't be involved with people breaking the law. Don't be involved with people skirting the law. If they were a legit client, the first thing I'd say is some level of segmentation. Least privilege is a beautiful thing.
Some structures appeared legal, some suspicious, some impossible to fully untangle. That ambiguity became part of the terror, because the leak revealed something uncomfortable about modern power. Illicit money and legitimate money often travel through the exact same doors, and those doors were now hanging wide open.
Now in the dawn of 2026, are we in a situation where even somebody who's relatively senior at the organization doesn't have a key that opens every door?
I would say yes. Occasionally you need people like that.
In Iceland, public outrage exploded after reporting connected Prime Minister Sigmundur Davíð Gunnlaugsson to an offshore company tied to his wife. Crowds gathered outside Parliament, protesters hurled eggs and demanded resignations. And within days, his government collapsed. This is when elites around the world begin to panic. Phones ring inside ministries and presidential compounds. Law firms activate crisis teams. Banking executives demanded internal reviews. Public relations advisors work through the night, constructing denials carefully engineered not to become perjury later.
So when we're talking to executives, and oftentimes executives will look at risk in such a way, well, what's the fine attached to that? And is it maybe just worth paying the fine because it's easier than dealing with what's necessary to avoid it and to be in compliance?
So the first thing is you have to be able to articulate a problem in a way that people understand. There's a business risk, there's a reputational risk. How do you think about that? How do you think about the cost of it? And what you're driving towards is what I always call like light bulb moments. And when we move past these, we're talking past each other and we're actually start communicating.
Some individuals insisted the offshore structures were fully legal. Many probably were. That was never the entire point. The real horror was scale, the realization that an invisible financial ecosystem had expanded so massively for so long that nobody, regulators included, fully understood where all the tunnels led anymore. And somewhere inside Mossack Fonseca, employees watched their clients appear in headlines, one after another, like bodies surfacing after a shipwreck. The firm responded aggressively, according to public statements. Mossack Fonseca insisted they complied with all anti-money laundering laws and international regulations.
CISOs often find themselves selecting or approving third-party vendors. We just did an episode about the HubSpot hack a few weeks ago where essentially that was a backdoor into all sorts of downstream crypto companies. But for you, what do you think would be a red flag that tells you to be careful of a particular third-party vendor?
So this is going to sound a little odd, but I always look at Glassdoor reviews. First place I look. And sometimes they don't have high ratings, they'll be in the 3s or whatever. But the thing to look for is like a consistency across reviews of lack of integrity or terrible culture. You have to take it with a grain of salt because the world is messy and sometimes things don't end well. But if you see a trend, if you see there's 50 reviews and 45 of them say the company takes shortcuts or the company culture is really toxic, that's a place where people take shortcuts. And then I think the other one is I always ask the question of, how do you know it works? And explain to me how you measure success. Not just your success, my success.
The company argued that offshore entities themselves were legal tools widely used for legitimate business purposes, estate planning and privacy. And technically, that's absolutely true. But that begs the question. Legality is not the same thing as innocence, especially when secrecy becomes the product itself. Outside the firm, another question spread through the cybersecurity world like a low electrical hum. How did this happen? Because breaches of this magnitude were almost unheard of at the time. 2.6 terabytes, 11.5 million files, decades of records.
This particular breach happened over the case of weeks, months, I think it's the better part of a year, where all of this data was slowly exfiltrated and handed over to this German newspaper. How do you defend against an adversary who's inside, quietly, slow and low, taking their time?
It's a really difficult problem in a professional services organization that need to know, do they even have access to it in the first place? That is, I think, the best way to defend against it, along with having a culture of where people are like invested in it.
Some security researchers later pointed toward vulnerable internet-facing infrastructure. According to analysis published after the leak, Mossack Fonseca reportedly operated outdated versions of software, including WordPress and Drupal installations.
The other piece to think about is a red team, blue team. So lots of people do pen tests. It's very helpful if you have somebody embedded in your security operations center.
Researchers at security firms suggested known vulnerabilities may have provided an entry point. Others suspected weak internal segmentation, poor encryption practices, or exposed email systems. But there was a problem with that theory. Nobody publicly knew for certain, and uncertainty breeds mythology. Some believed the source was an insider disgusted by corruption. Others suspected state intelligence involvement. Some even theorized criminal actors obtained access first and then passed the data elsewhere. No definitive public attribution ever emerged, which transformed the breach from an incident into something almost folkloric, a ghost operation, an invisible hand ripping open the financial underworld and disappearing without a trace. And then John Doe spoke again. In a statement later published through the ICIJ, the anonymous source framed the leak as an act against inequality in systemic corruption. They claimed the scale of offshore abuse had become too destructive to remain hidden. The decision to expose Mossack Fonseca's records to the public, that statement read, was made because the founders, employees, and clients have failed to uphold their legal and ethical obligations. The words landed like an anvil dropped from the top floor of an office tower. To critics, the source became a whistleblower, to others a criminal, to governments a threat. Because of this much hidden information could escape once, what else and who else was vulnerable?
Some folks would argue that the Panama Papers made the world a more fair place. What's your personal take on hacking in the name of justice?
Those two things can both be true. It can be theft and it can be helping serve justice.
Banks began reassessing exposure quietly behind closed doors. Wealth managers reviewed operational security. Corporate clients demanded audits. And across the offshore world, something far more dangerous than financial loss began spreading: doubt. The entire system depended on one fragile assumption, that secrecy was permanent. And now that assumption was dead. Late at night in cities all over the world, powerful men and women sat alone in dark rooms illuminated by laptop screens, typing their own names into search bars and waiting to see whether their secrets had survived. Before we continue, a question for the CISOs and security leaders watching this episode. If an employee leaks confidential data because they believe they're exposing wrongdoing, do you see them as a whistleblower or an insider threat? We'd love to hear what you think in the comments below. And now, Act 3, After the Illusion. The first consequence was noise. News anchors spoke over one another. Politicians issued statements that sounded like legal documents wearing human skin. Lawyers moved quickly, as lawyers do, when secrets once buried begin arriving in the form of subpoenas. And then came the second consequence: silence. The silence of doors being closed, the silence of reputations being recalculated, the silence of people realizing that a private decision made years earlier, maybe decades earlier, had become permanent public record. The Panama Papers did not merely expose accounts and companies and intermediaries. They exposed a belief system, quiet faith held by the wealthy and powerful, that secrecy could be purchased, layered, notarized, and made immortal. But data has no respect for status. Across the world, governments announced investigations. Tax authorities opened files. Prosecutors followed money trails through shell companies and nominee directors. And according to the ICIJ, the Panama Papers led to hundreds of investigations and helped governments recover or seek more than $1 billion in taxes, penalties, and other funds. The numbers mattered, but they did not capture the fear, because fear rarely lives in spreadsheets. It lives in the moment someone reads their own name in a headline and understands that denial will not erase the documents beneath it. In Iceland, the political damage had already become visible. Prime Minister Gunnlaugson stepped aside after the public's outrage. In other countries, ministers resigned, officials were questioned, and trust took another hit. Mossack Fonseca tried to survive the storm. The firm insisted it had operated within the law. It argued that service providers cannot always control what clients later do with corporate structures. It maintained that offshore companies are not inherently illegal. And of course, all of that is true enough to be useful and insufficient enough to be damning.
You mentioned there how difficult the job is. And I hear from countless CISOs about the emotional weight of this job. How do you bear that burden?
Don't do it by yourself. Oftentimes it's, well, this is easier to do myself. And it is in the short term. You might get a better answer in the short term, but in the long term, that's going to crush you. It's important not just to like, oh, they got it, I don't pay attention anymore. Check. In the Marine Corps, they used to say, inspect what you expect. Building people, building their capacity doesn't mean you're not engaged anymore, but it means you're engaged in a different way. You're engaged in, you become less of the doer and more of the coach.
For a time, the firm became less a company than a symbol. Its name turned radioactive. Clients fled, regulators circled, offices were raided. Authorities in multiple jurisdictions pursued inquiries. In 2018, Mossack Fonseca announced it would shut down. A firm that had helped build invisible rooms for the world's powerful could no longer hide from its own reflection. But the story did not end with a locked door in Panama City. It moved. That is what systems do when exposed. They adapt. Money finds new routes. Intermediaries rebrand, jurisdictions adjust, compliance language hardens, and the machinery becomes more careful, but not necessarily more moral.
What about zero trust humans? How do you balance trust and verification with culture and morale?
Trust but verify. It's one of my favorite quotes ever. I think you make it easy for people to do the right thing, and you make it hard to do the wrong thing. The Marine Corps would always tell you like 10% of the people cause 90% of your problems, and it seems to hold true no matter where I've been.
Some clients learn the lesson as a matter of ethics. Others learn it as an operational failure. Never put all your secrets in one place. Never assume a law firm server is a vault. Never mistake paperwork for protection. But somewhere in some other jurisdiction, another incorporation agent printed another certificate. Another nominee signed another form. Another beneficial owner remained politely absent from the page. The offshore world had been wounded, but it had not been ended.
A lot of leaders will spend a lot of time talking about and focusing on their tech stack and their tools. What mindset do you think that elite security programs have that others don't?
If we're not getting ahead, we're getting behind. So in biology, there's this hypothesis called the Red Queen effect. Basically, the Red Queen is like, hey, you've got to run just to keep up with me. You're going to have to run twice as fast to stay ahead. And the idea is that in an evolutionary species, they have to work harder to not go extinct, not just to stay where they are as they're competing against other species. I think that's true in technology as well. And it's not just digital technology. I think this is a thing that we've seen throughout history. Bronze swords were great until iron ones came along. And if you sit there and say, we're good, I think you're setting yourself up for failure. Complacency is always the enemy of security. So if you're not thinking about what the next thing is, if you're not thinking about what you're missing, what you're getting wrong, then I think you're putting yourself at a disadvantage.
The criminal questions continued. Who was John Doe? An insider, an external hacker, a whistleblower with access, or a coalition of people perhaps? Or even, perhaps, a state-backed operation disguised as moral outrage. The public record never answered definitively. And according to the source's own public statements, the motive was inequality, corruption, and the failure of legal systems to hold powerful actors accountable. But motive in a case like this remains partially trapped behind the same curtain the leak tried to tear down.
If you're not thinking about what you're missing, what you're getting wrong, then I think you're putting yourself at a disadvantage.
There were also human costs that rarely fit neatly into headlines. Employees who may have nothing to do with designing the system became attached to its collapse. Families were dragged into public scandal through relatives' poor financial decisions, and legitimate privacy seekers found themselves standing in the same searchable archive as fraudsters, kleptocrats, and sanctioned actors. The leak created justice in some places and unfair exposure for others, with massive collateral damage in the spaces in between. That is the uneasy truth of breaches at this scale. They don't behave like scalpels. They behave like hurricanes.
If your org was hit with a scandal-style leak tomorrow, what's the first thing a CISO should do and not do?
Well, the first thing, keep your mouth shut as much as possible. Communication is important, but precise communication is really important. If you don't know, then don't say you know.
For CISOs and security leaders, the Panama Papers left behind a lesson sharper than any compliance checklist. The most dangerous data in any organization is not always the data everyone protects. It is the data everyone has normalized. Files kept because storage is cheap and deletion is uncomfortable.
If there was one piece of mind-shifting advice that you could leave with CISOs before they walk away from this breach, what would it be?
If you're able to blend technical competence with empathy and understanding people and designing a good system, then that's where success lies. It's not in any one thing, it's in being able to make them all work together.
And now, our closing. Mossack Fonseca's business was secrecy, yet the firm's catastrophe came from the oldest failure in security, believing that your walls are stronger than your data is valuable. The breach also shattered a comforting myth about cybercrime. Not every catastrophic data loss announces itself with ransomware notes or countdown timers or encrypted screens. Sometimes there is no extortion portal, no skull logo, no customer support chat run by criminals. Sometimes the breach simply leaves quietly and the explosion comes months later and in public. Years after the first reports, the Panama Papers remain less a closed case than a permanent warning, a reminder that hidden systems accumulate pressure, a reminder that opacity is not control, a reminder that every secret has an infrastructure and every infrastructure has a failure mode. Here, in the financial district of Panama City, the humidity still hangs heavy. The afternoon rain is falling gently, and the massive ships continue to crawl through the canal. The legal world still helps hide fortunes and move mountains of money for those able to pay. But somewhere inside that movement, something has changed. Because for one brief moment, the offshore financial world became visible. For decades, the illusion survived because the public never saw the mechanism behind the magic. But once the bright lights of journalistic scrutiny hit the stage, the trap doors became visible, the hidden wires could suddenly be seen, and the illusion that protected the powerful no longer looked quite so convincing. The performance could never feel the same again. And so, we must remain forever vigilant and always listening for the CISO signal. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, share, and subscribe. If you didn't, thanks for listening this long. We'll see you on the next episode of the CISO Signal. All episodes are based on publicly available reports, postmortems, and expert analysis. While we've done our best to ensure accuracy, some cybersecurity incidents evolve over time, and not all details have been confirmed. Our goal is to inform and entertain, not to assign blame. Where facts are unclear, we've used cautionary language, and we always welcome your corrections. Thanks for listening to the CISO Signal.